All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Logan A'Hearn. I'm a rising third-year undergraduate studying philosophy, minoring data science here at Vanderbilt. And my freshman year, I took a class with Dr. Holly Tucker on the French Revolution. However, this wasn't really your typical history class. In the class, each student would take on a role of character in the National Assembly, which is kind of the governing body that would decide what the future of France's government would look like back in 1791. So it was a very immersive approach to learning history. Each player would have various objectives that they would need to fulfill in order to succeed in the game. Players could write letters to each other, as well as converse via Slack. And although the class was immersive, I learned a lot about the French Revolution when Professor Tucker reached out to me last spring and told me about an opportunity to potentially integrate AI with the class. I was very intrigued because not only could this really lead to a more immersive experience for students, but it could also help alleviate some of the burden put on the teaching team, which I will be on in the fall. So now I'll pass it off to Sovann to introduce the rest of the team.
Thanks, Logan. As Jesse said earlier, Dr. Holly Tucker is in charge of the project, the director of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities, and the professor for the class. Umang Chaudhry is our a data science at the Data Science Institute and our project lead. Logan A'Hearn is an undergraduate studying philosophy and data science. Myself, Sovann Chang, and Ricky Sun, we are both rising second-year data science master's students. And our fifth member who cannot be here today is Casey Barrett, a recently graduated master's student from the Data Science Institute.
So as Logan briefly mentioned, Dr. Tucker came to us with two objectives, all surrounding AI. So we wanted to augment the classroom experience with AI and also find ways to alleviate the burden of work from the teaching team. A lot of the times this involves responding to letters that students wrote to a non-playing character, and that can take a lot of time. So what we did was develop a tool that will allow the teaching faculty to kind of use AI to expedite that process.
So in order to improve the classroom experience, both students and instructors, our team has worked mainly on two features. One is letter writing, as Umang mentioned, which will be dealing with situations like student writing to non-player NPCs like George Washington. And previously, most of these letters are not responded, but now generative AI can help. The other one will be the social network analysis, which will help the instructor and teaching team to keep track of the messages across different Slack channels, how players are connected to with each other, and how, for example, sentiment is developed over time and more. Now let's dive into the letter writing UI first.
So as Umang kind of gets that pulled up, we're going to do a demo of it. I can give some context on the letter writing UI a little bit more because it can kind of be confusing for somebody who hasn't really taken the class before or understands the game. So it's really, letter writing is an immersive experience for students in the game. And we wanted to create a tool that would allow students who play the role of historical figures to write letters to non-player characters who are at the same time still historically relevant. So for example, it's played by a student in the game is Francois Houteau, and he could write a letter to George Washington, who is actually not a played character in the game, but we wanted to create a tool that would allow for George Washington to send a response back to Francois Houteau in order to make it more immersive for the students. The tool's meant for use by the teaching team, though, and since history is part up to random chance, so is the French Revolution game. So the tool kind of walks the professor and the course assistants through the whole process of receiving a letter from the student to generating a response from the non-player character. So as you can see, Umang has kind of put in up there the adjudicator, which is the person who will actually be using the tool so that data can be tracked. And then he uploaded the letter. And then we have a button called View Letter that just kind of allows the adjudicator to see the raw, unformatted output of the letter. Underneath that, we have the sender and receiver input boxes, and that is just because the model needs input, or the prompt needs that input in order to, give an accurate output. And then the game session is kind of just the date that is also relative that needs to be tracked. And then we have the generate summary button, which kind of generates an ask of that letter, or a summary of that ask. And now I will pass it to Sovann, and he will talk about kind of generating the outcomes.
Right. So as a core part of the game, Dr. Tucker has introduced a bit of an element of chance to this. So for each time that a letter is sent, there is a potential list of things that can happen. The receiver of the letter can respond favorably, they can respond unfavorably. There are various outside influences that could have an effect on it. And we wanted to put in a function for her to be able to do this automatically so that she doesn't have to come up with the list of outcomes by herself. So that's what that generate outcomes button is. And you can see that it generated a few different outcomes. It looks like 3 favorable outcomes, a couple negative ones, and one where the letter is intercepted by political rivals before it even reaches George Washington. She has the ability to set the odds in the right on that column. We're just going to set the odds of one of them at 100%, just so we can control what this die roll looks like. If Umang rolls the dice, it's going to select that outcome. And using that outcome, we can then generate a letter from George Washington back to Francois Louis Houteau, which basically follows the layout that outcome says. So this is the generated letter. It's done in the writing style and using the tone of George Washington. And now what we can do is download the generated letter and the adjudication summary, which basically is, it tells who was in charge of doing all of this. And Umang can talk about that a little bit.
Right. So this tool is great, but it's very important as a course instructor in order to keep track of what has been going on. So downloading the adjudication summary essentially will allow Dr. Tucker to keep a record of exactly what happened in the game, who was responding to whom, and also gives Dr. Tucker an ability to go back and see what kind of outcomes and odds were considered and which one was selected, in order to see maybe at what point did the trajectory of the French Revolution during the class take a turn. So this adjudication summary is just a text file, which is pretty much all the text that you see up here, including the sender, receiver, the game session, just everything in one nice text file that Dr. Tucker can use to just go back and take a look at at the end of this.
So yeah, as Umang brings us back to our presentation, that was one of the tools we were able to develop, was that letter writing UI, which is pretty cool. But we also worked on another kind of project, and that was looking at the Slack data. So in addition to formal writing in the class, letters between characters, there's also, students can also converse with each other in character via Slack. And there's a multitude of channels, public discussion channels for kind of all the different characters, alliance channels, and we wanted to examine how kind of characters interact with each other in these channels and see what their relationships look like. So, because this would kind of help the teaching team get a better idea of what exactly is going on in the class, especially in those channels that they can't see. So I'll pass it off to Ricky. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the things we are able to see from this.
So thank you, Logan. So as Logan mentioned, the social network analysis can be used in a variety of different ways in this project. To evaluate the strength of the factions that form and other interpersonal relationships. This could also be used to determine inflection points within the game. There's also interest to develop a web map that visualizes the network formed between entities and the revolution to enhance understanding for students and for instructors. This can also determine the attributes of strong players, which in turn will help with student character matching. Using the in-game data will also help aim to better understand character attributes to develop a more robust survey to determine student character casting. So let's jump into the visualizations. Before we jump into the network analyses, let's take a brief look at some general descriptive stats. Here we can keep track of the most active users in general by total messages they send. The next slide will be an example of an interactive dashboard we can also use to keep track of user messages across different channels. Then we can move on to the network analysis and see the interactions among users. Here will be an example of the nodes-based, which show how many connections does one player have to other players. This could also be on like the lines. So the lines can be colored and represent how many messages sent to each users. And thanks, Logan, for the sentiment analysis part of the network analysis by users. Of course, the count of messages is quite interesting, but looking at things like sentiment or looking to more about actual messages like the natural language will be much more interesting. And here we used average sentiment by user for the most active channels because there are, as mentioned, 500 channels in total. So it's better we only choose the top channels in this case. We can see the average sentiment for different users. So with an negative one to be the most negative and one to be the most positive. We see every user has a positive sentiment in general, but it's also interesting to see different TAs have different sentiments. So we used the just one sentiment density to represent sentiment. So this may not be like 100% accurate. So in the future, there's definitely room for improvement. And next slide. So although this is still preliminary, we can see the network of sentiment for messages among users, like whether it's positive or negative among different users or even between TA and different users, for example. And of course, there are great room for improvements and making all these visualizations. Potentially, we can make all of these visualizations into interactive dashboard, for example. But this should be a good starting point. And this can be beyond sentiment. We can do other natural language tasks on these lab data. Now I will hand back to Logan to talk about the impact of our project.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. So as we've been able to see through both our letter writing tool that we developed, as well as some of the network analysis of the Slack data that we did, we were able to build tools that not only augment the classroom experience for the student, but also kind of take some of that burden off of members of the teaching team, as well as the professor, in this case, Professor Tucker. The kind of work that we did, it's just one of the ways that a class can be augmented and assisted with the help of AI. And the methods that we use can be scaled to similar reacting to the past classes, because this is kind of a unique role-playing class, but also to just any other class that wants to integrate AI and have both students use it, as well as kind of help out with teaching assistants and the burden that teaching can sometimes be, and help make a class much more experiential. So yeah, thank you all for listening. That was our project on the French Revolution.
We have time for just a few questions. Any questions from anyone about this project? You can go ahead and unmute, or you can ask in the chat. Well, I have one question. Holly Tucker, yes, great work, absolutely. It's been wonderful seeing where you all have gone in with this project and the immense progress that you've made. I have a question about that letter to George Washington. Did someone have to like read it and come up with the possible alternatives of what could be happening? Where did that come from? So could you say, hey, it could have been intercepted. He could have said no. Where did those different options come from?
Sovann, do you want to take that? I know you dealt with a lot with the different outcomes.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Are you referring to how it worked previously or how it currently works at the moment with in the app?
In the app.
Okay. Yes.
Whichever is more interesting.
Oh, right. So initially, Dr. Tucker would have to do that all herself. She would have to come up with a few different outcomes that she thought would be interesting, and actually physically roll a die to see what it landed on. But now we basically gave OpenAI and ChatGPT a prompt, and it says, here is this letter. Please come up with a few different options as to what could happen with this letter. So we explicitly told it, get a mix of some favorable and unfavorable responses for the person who sent the letter. So some of the responses will be exactly what the person asked for. And some of the responses will be maybe a little bit of it, but mostly, sorry, I can't do that. And there is a third option, which was put in to give the model some creativity. And it's basically, you can also do, you referring to the model here, you can also do something where some outside influence has an effect on the circumstances that completely changes the context of things. And so that is where that letter is intercepted by political rivals comes into play. So it was really all done through prompting. You give it the letter, you give it some background, and you say, come up with some solutions, and that's what it does.
Fantastic. So this will work with any, you can bring any historical figure to life, then not just George Washington. Fantastic. Well, again, congratulations on terrific project. Can't wait to hear about the students that get to play and interact with all the historical figures and the insight that will come from the network analysis. Great work, team.